coming out today. I know the weather is probably not nearly as interesting as it was last week, but we're so fortunate to have DePodwin from AccuWeather give us the weather briefing for this week. So take it away.
Thanks very much. It's been a couple of years since I've done this, so we'll see if I'm still a little rusty. I don't forecast every day anymore, so apologies for any mistakes ahead of time. But I have a couple of different things to start with, and then I'll get into what's going on in the U.S. and briefly touch on the windstorm in Europe that's coming tomorrow and Wednesday. So just a couple things to start here. Once the computer decides to respond. For those of you who don't know me, my name is DePodwin. I work at AccuWeather. I was in operational forecasting there for 3 or 4 years, and I now lead our core weather content teams. We're responsible for bringing in different data sets from around the world from different government partners of ours and private industry partners. Find me on Twitter at WXDepot or send me an email if you have any questions. Happy to answer them. It's been a pretty crazy last couple of weeks with tropical systems both in the Atlantic and in the Western Pacific. And some of you may have seen this video already, but I figured it's pretty cool and worth showing. A time lapse here of the hurricane hunters in Florence from earlier, I guess it was probably late last week. Figured I would do a couple of just brief overview of sort of what we know of Florence here as it starts to move out, and the last rain of it really is on the East Coast here this afternoon. It's been responsible for, I think the last tally is 32 fatalities. It broke the North Carolina's tropical rainfall record of 24.06. That was in Floyd during '99. It is also the 9th wettest tropical system to impact the contiguous United States. It was the wettest system in South Carolina as well. And these are the 2 highest totals I could find this morning from North Carolina and South Carolina, respectively. So close to 36 in North Carolina and close to 24 inches of rain in South Carolina. So really an unprecedented event in that part of the country, and strikingly similar to Harvey, just basically a year later, but in a different area of the U.S. This was a rainfall map as of yesterday evening across Carolina, North and South Carolina. Probably updated a bit since then, but generally speaking, you see such a wide spread area of 5 to 10 inches, which is fairly unusual, and just that the 10-inch area goes basically all the way across the southern section, or the southeastern section of North Carolina. From my count, according to the SPC filtered reports, 24 tornadoes were reported with Florence. That includes the couple that were yesterday down, I think that was in the Richmond area. Highest wind gust that in Wilmington was 105, which was the highest since Helene in 1958, which I'll touch on Helene in a few minutes here. And it now is the wettest year on record for Wilmington with over 86 inches of rain. In their previous record, I think that's supposed to be 1887 or 1877, so it's been a long time. We've held the record of 83.6, and we obviously have 3 months of the year to go. So an extremely impressive event, and just an impressive year in Wilmington with a lot of other rain events that have made it the wettest year on record. I wanted to touch on 3 Category 4 storms in history that have hit the Carolinas, just sort of as a comparison to what happened in Florence. It's interesting, they're all H's. I don't know, something about H in the Carolinas and Category 4 storms. But the first is Hazel back in 1954. And I think the important point about these 3 storms I'll mention is how different they are from each other, how they're all Category 4 storms, but they're really different in terms of the impact. Hazel had an 18-foot storm surge in some spots, and it coincided with the highest lunar tide of the year, so that certainly played a role in that. This surface map on the right is from the day of landfall, October 15th, 1954. It's a great quote from the Weather Bureau that all traces of civilization on the immediate waterfront between the state line and Cape Fear were practically annihilated, showing how much the storm surge did damage, and that you can see from this surface map, that area that's mentioned here would have been in the northeastern quadrant of the storm as Hazel made landfall. New York City reported 113 mile-an-hour wind speed from this. You can probably gather that's because of the interaction with the synoptic system off to the north. So a very different setup than what happened in Florence. Obviously, a fast-moving storm getting caught up in the flow and moving northward. And this caused 95 fatalities in the U.S., many more across the Caribbean, but there were 95 killed in the U.S. from Hazel. In 1958, just 4 years later, the 50s were sort of crazy in the Carolinas and in much of the East Coast. That's an entire other discussion. But Helene never really made landfall. It sat 10 miles off the coast, and really it came through at a period, I believe it passed through basically during low tide. It did not cause much in the way of storm surge. There was only, from what I could find, one death that was indirect. I think someone, I don't know how they describe indirect or define indirect, but it really, while it caused damage and 135 miles an hour in Wilmington, it really didn't do much in the way of damage compared to Hazel or Hugo or Florence or a lot of the other systems that have impacted that region, even though the fact it was a Category 4 storm. Part of that probably because of the fact that the eastern and northeastern side of the storm stayed offshore. Also, the area that it struck there in the Wilmington area was only half as populous as it was today, so there are many less people living in that region. So just goes to show you that a Category 4 storm in Hazel and also a Category 4 storm in Helene can do very different impacts depending on track and the situation with tide cycles and such. And then lastly, Hugo in 1989, which was sort of, I think, a benchmark storm for many people in the Carolinas. It was, at the time, the most damaging hurricane ever recorded. It's now only the 17th costliest in the U.S., having been surpassed by many storms such as Andrew, Katrina, Harvey. In South Carolina alone, 3,300 single-family homes were destroyed. I think it was something like 10,000 or more multifamily homes were destroyed in South Carolina. From what I could find, the highest surge observation was 20 feet, which is extremely significant. And there were 36 fatalities, so very similar number of fatalities that we know so far with Florence compared to. That does not count Puerto Rico.
I believe one was here in State College.
Yeah, really?
From Hugo, because a tree branch on one of the trees out the side of Old Main, one of the branches came down and killed it. Yeah,
yeah, I remember that.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that does not include Puerto Rico, I don't believe. I think I just had CONUS in that number of fatalities. There was a lot more in Puerto Rico. It was very destructive.
Yeah, that's what was there.
Sort of a, I wouldn't say a similar track to Florence, but definitely went inland and then recurved. But obviously Florence is sort of heading off the East Coast now. This went through and across the Appalachians, but again, more of a quicker moving storm. The maximum rainfall listed here is only 10.5 or just under 10.5 inches. So certainly concentrated areas of heavy rain, but mainly just right along the coast there, and then again in the Appalachians of North Carolina. So again, another storm with Category 4 strength and landfall, but very different impacts that occurred from Hugo in 1989.
Kind of incredible looking at the case of Hugo, and I mean, we saw with the 50s storm, I mean, that was catastrophic up in Canada. That was the first real major flood event in Hazel in Toronto history there. I mean, they had no clue that tropical cyclones could get up there, and they basically flooded out all of downtown Toronto and killed 8 people. But just the fact that we've had all these major storms, and Hazel was the only one that really had an onshore prefrontal rain event, the only one that really had this huge extratropical transition type scenario compared to the other two, it seems, at least from a precip distribution standpoint.
Yeah, that's a great point, Kevin. And I think also it's interesting to compare Florence and maybe Hazel to what happened with Joaquin a couple years ago, where you had a situation where the storm never made landfall, but because of the interaction with the synoptic flow, you had a significant rain event for 4 or 5 days across South Carolina that ended up being one of the worst across South Carolina in history. And I think Helene, from what I was looking at earlier, you can see the track going across Atlantic Canada. They had 3 to 4 inches of rain, I think, in some spots from that storm, which isn't 8 or 9 inches, but certainly impactful to them back in 1958. And my main point with all of this here is just that, as we think about forecasting these events, that there's a whole other discussion about whether Saffir-Simpson scale is the way to go, which we'll hold for another time. But that Category 4 storms, each of those was a Category 4. Some were impactful, more, and others were much more so. Whereas Florence was a 2 at landfall, I think. So the category really is just a guide, and we need to understand how to communicate what the impacts are, whether it be storm surge or rainfall from certain storms or the wind in other situations. I think using climatology is really important. I know with Florence, it was at one point there were really no storms that were in a location that Florence was in that had ever made landfall in the U.S. So it was sort of an outlier in terms of that. But also realizing that the chances of a Category 4 storm to make landfall in the Carolinas is rare. And there was some forecasts of that about 5 days out. A lot of the model guides are showing that. That's very rare, and I don't believe there's ever been a Category 5 that's ever made landfall in the Carolinas. So it's got to be extremely unusual for that to happen. Also, to make sure we understand the storm speed and how that impacts the rainfall amounts, whether storms occur or make landfall during high tide, or if they do make landfall during high tide, do they breaking the coast? Do they stay in the same spot for a while? Does the easterly flow or the onshore flow in this case, does that sustain for more than one high tide cycle? Because that will obviously increase the damage along the coast. New Bern had a challenge where they were they got flooded out at high tide at midnight. I think it was on Thursday night, and then they sort of receded during Friday morning, and then they were again on an easterly flow as the wind came around again later during Friday, and they flooded again. So the number of high tide cycles definitely matters from a damage and impact standpoint. And then conveying the confidence in the forecast, what is known and what is less certain. And there's always a discussion on whether to use historical comparisons of historical storms. I think there's positives and negatives to it. Saying that this would be like Harvey is an interesting comparison. It certainly was in many ways, but if you're in North Carolina, you don't know what the impact of Harvey was, most likely because you lived in North Carolina and not Texas. So does it help someone living in Wilmington or Fayetteville that you tell them it's going to be like Harvey? So I think that's an interesting discussion to have about whether historical comparisons are worthwhile.
It was an early historical comparison that was made on several slides that said no storm that originated was ever hit Carolina.
Correct. Yeah.
And so it completely failed.
Correct. So it's really tough to use historical comparisons. I mean, climatology is good in many ways, and it maybe would have helped in this case to tamp down the intensity forecasts. I think the track forecasts were really quite good.
Except the FP3 that had a weak storm the whole time.
Yeah, right. But there was a lot of, I mean, the H work went pretty gangbusters with this most of the time, I think. So, any other thoughts on Florence or other Carolina hurricanes or questions?
Just an observation, Dan. There was a hurricane in, I think it was '84, called Diana.
Yeah.
That actually took a similar track to Florence, and that it had come all the way up to the Outer Banks and then back west-southwestward into South Carolina. But it weakened in doing so.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I remember looking at this one at some point in the last week or so. There's a little loop-de-loop there.
Yeah, yeah. And then went out again.
And went out. Yep.
It was a pretty powerful storm when it stalled. And what was it, Category 3?
Category 2 at landfall,
Yeah.
but probably looks like it got to a 3 probably before it peaked. Before it peaked. Yeah. So I'll transition from that to what's going on currently here, both in the U.S. and I figured I'd start briefly just sort of where it's interesting weather is occurring across Europe. It's starting to become that time of year as we head into the autumn months where the wind events become much more common, and the UK Met Office starts to name their storms. This is Storm Alley, I believe. I don't know if they go in alphabetical order there. But this is Alley, which will be impacting the United Kingdom here as we head through the middle of the week. You can see that we've got a pretty potent little low spinning around this upper level disturbance across the northern part of the UK and bringing probably some very gusty showers as it lifts to the northeast. So this is pretty common for them this time of year, but certainly a pretty impactful event with wind gusts probably on the order of 40 to 60 miles per hour at least.
Is the remnants of Joyce or?
It's a good question. I think it is Lean. I think that's right. So they rename it to Alley, I guess. They've had that for a long time. It's all this discussion in the U.S. about whether we should be naming storms or not. The Met Office has named these synoptic events for a long time. I'm not sure how many years. I'm not sure anyone knows how long they've done it for, but it's been a while. Yeah.
I know one of the only ones I think they kept Ophelia. Was that last year?
Yes, they did.
I think they just kept that one because it was tropical so close to it. But
That's a great point. One of the tools that I like to use, this is from the European Center. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's available on the AccuWeather Pro Animator, but it's the EFI data set, which is Extreme Forecast Index, and it's basically taking all of the members of the European ensemble and comparing it to a model climate. The idea behind it, as they state on their website, is that by design, it's supposed to negate the effect of model bias. And the idea is just to sort of point out where there's unusual events or things that warrant more attention. In this case, you can see this is the wind gust parameter for the EFI, showing that there's a high likelihood, basically, of an unusual event across the UK with high wind gusts that are climatologically abnormal. And that's the period ending at 0Z on Thursday, and then the period ending at 0Z on Friday. So definitely a signal, and then that would, as a forecaster, might spur you to look into more of the details. Here are the predicted wind gusts. This is the max wind gust to forecast hour, but tough to read the numbers probably. But you can see that generally there's a 50 to 60 knot corridor across Scotland, really, and northern England. So a pretty significant event for them. So jumping back to the United States here, and closer to home, here's our surface analysis as of 12Z this morning. We've got what's left of Florence trying to sneak off the East Coast, and a front trying to move it along here. It's coming through the Great Lakes. Rich was noting the cool outflow boundary that was coming through Chicago earlier this morning. And here is that outflow on GOES 16 with some lightning that was associated with it, has since sort of just dissipated. We still have some pretty intense lightning across southern Iowa. And that front continues to go back across the plains and into the Rockies as well. A secondary front back here across the northern Great Plains, and it's been pretty chilly across the Canadian Rockies. I think Calgary's had some pretty impressive snow or areas around there in the Canadian Rockies over the last week or so. So snow is on the way, just not here where we continue to be on the warmer side. Do we know if we've had an under 60-degree night in September so far? Once, twice,
One or two.
Last week.
We got a couple. Yeah.
Currently, where are we on here for the month to date? 4.5 above normal on the month, and 7.2 inches of rain, the third wettest September so far. So pretty warm and muggy. September feeling much more like August. It's sort of been that way all summer, it feels like. Pretty quiet across the southeast this afternoon, high pressure. Thankfully, some dry weather from the Carolinas. And yeah, I'll jump to satellite here. We see what's left of Florence, sort of with that trough that extends off to the south. Behind it, some dry air trying to filter in, some lower clouds across the western part of Pennsylvania have since started to dissipate, and now we're just into the sort of strato Q type situation here on this northerly flow, and trying to dry out, although I don't think dew points have fallen off too much yet. And pretty quiet across the Ohio Valley as well, and we see the what's left of this thunderstorm complex moving on south across Iowa. The rain associated with this trough and what's left of Florence, and some pretty heavy downpours still, although I don't know if the rainfall totals across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic were as impressive as maybe some people, as we may have thought initially with this. I didn't have a chance to look at it. Did anyone see any totals from the Mid-Atlantic or Northeast this morning?
I got an inch in my eye.
Yeah. Seems like an inch or two seems like the norm with this. Maybe some more here in some of these heavier bands as they.
People jumped on some ridiculously low sea runs last week.
Yeah. Yep.
Like 7 to 11 inches.
At one point, it looked like it would just dump for 36 hours, but the good news is it was kind of moved out pretty quickly, unlike Gordon.
Yeah, it seemed like a convective training that was frogged by a lot of malls just totally fell apart last night. There were some spots that kind of had it, but not a lot.
Agreed. Now let's just take a quick look at the rest of the U.S. here. The west is quiet, as you might expect. Pretty wet across Iowa, and then again quiet across the southeast. A couple of popcorn storms trying to fire up. Take a look at the forecast here briefly. Let me go to the U.S. here and not Europe. And to sort of see what I think the most interesting thing. There's not a lot of interesting weather for us in Central PA. I don't think over the next few days, but probably the question of whether it will rain on Sunday. So we've got this little piece of energy down here by Baja. That this looks to be the piece, maybe with some of the energy from this trough, that tries to move into the central part of the country here as we head into the later part of the week. And it appears that this piece of energy is the one that could bring us some rain on Sunday. This northern branch piece probably slides too far to the north, and it's pretty progressive. It doesn't do a whole lot. I mean, it's associated with the front, and then we dry out behind the front as this lifts off to the east. But then we have this lingering, depending on the model you like, but this lingering piece across the southern Great Plains. The European brings this as a pretty decent piece of energy across Pennsylvania into Sunday, which could bring us some showers or maybe stay just to the south. But GFS doesn't have much. It sort of shears it all out, and we're left with basically dry and again a pretty zonal flow. So that's sort of the question I think in the forecast for us is, does it rain here later in the weekend? It does look like we get a weakening front into the area on Friday night into Saturday, but then high pressure builds in behind it, pretty good high pressure system. So a pretty nice day Saturday, at least that's the look now. And then we'll see Sunday. This is the 6E GFS. I'll pull up the 12 in a second, but sort of keeps it south of us. The European yesterday was a little wetter than it is today. Again, maybe a shower or two, but mainly off to the south. Let's go to, here's the E-wall version of the 12Z GFS. Sunday morning, dry. I think it, at this point, it's probably more likely to be dry than wet, but probably a little tough to be definitive at this point. Something I wanted to pull up briefly is just from an ensemble standpoint. This is another tool that's available on the animator here that's a combination of a number of ensembles. This is the European along with the GFS and the GEFs, and in the short range, the SREF. Past 84 hours, it's just the GEFs and the European. So if we go out to Sunday at 8 p.m., this is the probability of greater than 1/100 of an inch of precipitation based on the 72 different members, I think, of this ensemble, combining different ensembles together to form a multi-model ensemble, and basically a 50% chance. But definitely more likely off to the south, as sort of is supported by the deterministic runs. And if we look at chances of over 1/10 of precipitation, less so, with about 30% chance or so. Let's see. Aside from that, looks like we're dry the rest of today. I mean, I guess there could be a sprinkle perhaps, but probably nothing more than that. And then a dry middle part of the week with warm front lifting on north. Again, maybe some showers on Friday night, and then we dry out Saturday. Looks like a nice start of the weekend. I guess we talked briefly about the game in Champaign, right, on Friday night, with Penn State playing Illinois on the rare Friday night kickoff. Looks like, I haven't given this a close look, but front's probably out of there by the time they kick off on Friday, which is 8 p.m. Right, 8 p.m. Central.
Your multi-model ensemble probably is the best thing to look at.
Yep.
So
So 24-hour period ending at, we'll say, 8 p.m. Saturday. So
I would
yeah, I'll pull up 6 hour. I think it's 8 p.m. Central, right?
It's 8 p.m.
Yeah, Central, not Eastern.
Yeah. Oh, let's look at. So here's 6 p.m. Sorry, the 6 hour probability ending 2 a.m. Eastern Saturday. Probably south. I always forget where Champaign is. Somewhere. Middle of the state, right?
closer than you have border than you are.
Right here.
I think it was. A little further on. In South, there you go. And it might 57.
So probably a dry game at this point, given the timing.
Can't be one of the pit.
Can't be one of the pit.
I think inevitably in the Big Ten's first big showcase Friday night game with their new setup, we're gonna get a lightning delay. It's gonna start at 1 a.m.
Right.
Eastern time.
Right. That would be what would happen, right? This would slow down a bit. We'd have a thunderstorm, right? A kick, and yeah, yep. Something I want to touch on briefly. I don't know how likely this is, but there's been some hinting that Florence might, a piece of it might sort of just hang on off the coast, and sort of stew about, and then maybe try to do something next week. Again, this is from this multi-model ensemble, and you can see that there's a couple of members that try to have these low pressure centers that sort of just sit, definitely a trough here off of North Carolina into Thursday. You've got a couple of different members trying to show a center of low pressure, definitely lower surface pressure though in that vicinity. So something to keep an eye on. See that again, generally this is the spread in shaded, so there's definitely a spread in that area. And again, a couple members trying to show a closed area of low pressure that we're depicting here. So it's something to keep an eye on. I noticed that on the tracking page here, I haven't seen this plot before until this morning actually, but this is on the RAL page that plots all the different tracks. This is the 60 run of the GFS showing the ensemble curve box plot. Again, I'm not familiar with this really, except for the fact that I looked at it this morning from 0Z and it had it circling down south towards off the coast of the Carolinas. This one from 60 has it just going on out to sea. So something to note, doesn't seem like a high likelihood at this point, but we've seen things do stranger stuff, like Ivan. Back in, I forget what year that was. But I think that's everything I had. I guess the only thing I'll hit on briefly at the end is if we're looking for some cooler temperatures, this is the 500 millibar 5-day height anomaly forecast from the European ensemble. This is the previous 5 days. So this is ending Monday afternoon next week. And we see that the ridge tries to break down as we head into sort of the later part of next week. Maybe we finally get a trough in here. And there's the corresponding 2 meter temperature anomaly. So still on the warmer side into next week, at least compared to normal. And it looks like the cool weather across the Canadian Rockies and the plains up there stays with us here as we head into the later part of the month. And that's everything I had, so I'll take any questions or other comments. Or
Looks like at first glance that zonal, the flow is going to go over North America over the next 10 to 14 days. We're kind of loading the atmospheric gun to get fall going at some point. I mean, we can isolate those high latitudes for a while and generate it with the cold air. We'll finally start getting a little bit more autumn-like temperatures going on.
That's a good point.
Eventually, but we'll see. You also have to get something to knock it out of place, and that ridge you were showing at the tail end there, at the end, at least in the spread, seems to suggest that maybe we'll have our first possible mechanism for our first real autumn-like cold air surge if it happens. But that's not very anomalous for being too strong of a signal this far out right now.
No, it's not.
Any other questions, comments? All right, well, thanks, Sid. And then next week we have Tyler Royce.